Hello, my name is Chris Snipes, and you are listening to The Melt.
DMT is a miracle. I mean, DMT is like something that fell out of a flying saucer. I mean, it is so strong and so psychedelic. I mean, I can't imagine being more smashed than that, or wanting to be. I mean, it's more like a near-death experience than any near-death experience I ever heard anybody describe. They sound absolutely pedestrian compared to a DMT trip where, you're sure you're dead. You say, what the hell else could it be? I've never seen it hit anybody quite as hard as it hit me, but I was transformed in a moment from a Marxist, skeptic, scientist. It was then, and I will say it still is now, it is pure 100% magic. It's magic. It's not a drug. It's an event. It's not something that you do. It's something which happens to you. And people come out of it saying, what happened? What happened?
That was Terence McKenna articulating why he was so jazzed about DMT. Eventually, DMT would be given the thumbs up to be allowed to be administered to a group of volunteers in a clinical setting to observe and document the effects of intravenous doses of DMT. The results were both highly compelling and somewhat startling in regards to what they revealed about our perceptions of the limitations of our physical bodies and the possible vast worlds that lie beyond the veil of this coarse material dimension. Many of the volunteers no longer feared death and felt a renewed sense of purpose in their lives. The often very intense experience of DMT, albeit taking barely 15 minutes from beginning to end, was so otherworldly and vivid that it left the volunteers feeling as if they'd actually visited another place and had interacted with entities that seemed to inhabit this place. Terence called them self-transforming machine elves, entities that seemed to be trying to communicate with him via constantly transforming, complex geometrical shapes that could bounce. Today's guest, Rick Strassman, is the psychiatrist who performed those experiments and who wrote the written account of them in the book DMT, the Spirit Molecule. Many years later, he wrote the follow-up book, DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, which compares the DMT experience to the prophetic experiences that appear in the Hebrew Bible. I start off the conversation by asking Rick what it was that compelled him to begin researching the DMT experience in the first place.
Well, I began with a long-standing interest in the biology of spiritual experience, and that led me first to study the pineal gland, its production of melatonin. This was in the 1980s, and there wasn't much known about the human function of melatonin. And there were some preliminary data indicating that that melatonin had profound mind-altering effects. And because I was interested in the pineal gland as a kind of a spiritual organ, the biology might have supported that objectively if melatonin turned out to be mind-altering. So we studied melatonin very carefully, and it didn't really turn out to have much other than sedating effects, and that's pretty much what it's used for nowadays. And in the meantime, I learned about DMT and began a 2-year process of obtaining permits and funding. Began the study in 1990. And my thinking about DMT is that it's a naturally produced compound in the body, the human body, and it's quite psychedelic. So it was a ready-made candidate for being involved in the biology of spiritual experience. So my initial thinking was that if I gave DMT to humans, to people, and they described experiences that were similar to what you read about in the religious literature, then that would support a role for naturally occurring elevated DMT to play a role in those non-drug states. So my thinking, was, to the extent that giving DMT produced effects that are seen in non-drug religious experiences, then there must be some common biological denominator, that the brain levels of DMT increase to the extent that the two sets of experiences overlap. So the spiritual model that I brought to bear on the study was the Buddhist enlightenment model. I'd been trained in Zen Buddhism, Soto Zen, and had studied it and practiced it for a long time, and was expecting that the peak spiritual experience in the DMT state would be what's called Kensho, or Satori, enlightenment, a blast with no content, no feeling, thinking, no self, no time, no space, completely devoid of anything discernible, sort of a fusion with the one. But in my volunteers, only one of the nearly 6 volunteers had that kind of experience. The vast majority, had experiences described a state that was, full of content, visual, colorful, usually or oftentimes inhabited by a sentient intelligence, as opposed to just being the void. There was interactions between the volunteer and the material in the state. The personality and the sense of self and will were maintained. So that was all different than what both the volunteers expected, because a large number of them were meditators, and was different than what I expected. So after I finished the study, I went back to the drawing board and looked at alternative spiritual models that fulfill the criteria of what my DMT volunteers reported, which was a feeling of the state was more real than real. There were beings with whom they interacted. They maintained an ability to think, to question, to observe. So I returned to my Jewish roots from my Buddhist foray, and started to read the Hebrew Bible, because that's the foundational text. And I was struck by the the concept of the prophetic state, which resembled that brought on by giving DMT. And by a prophetic state, I mean any spiritual experience described by any figure in the Hebrew Bible. It isn't just the canonical prophets like Ezekiel or Jeremiah, but it could be anybody. Ishmael's mother, who encounters a couple of angels when she's wandering through the desert. So any spiritual experience, encountering beings, which occurs in the DMT state, powerful emotions of fear or ecstasy, the sense that what they were undergoing or witnessing was more real than real, the ability to interact with the contents, feeling of, reverence and awe and overwhelming power in the state. So I compared the two sets of experiences, the prophetic state in the Bible and the DMT state, and really found a lot of phenomenological similarities along the lines that I described. One thing about prophecy is most people nowadays think about it as prediction or foretelling. Uh, but those reports are few and far between in the text. And even when they appear, they're pretty hard to understand. So if you broaden the definition to include any spiritual experience, it could be ecstasy without any visions. It could be visions without any feelings. It could be inordinate courage that seems divinely inspired. So all of those would fit the bill or be included in a broader notion of the prophetic experience or of prophecy.
And it's interesting because usually you see correlations between psychedelic experiences and their peaks, and usually it lends itself to Eastern philosophies. Usually there's the Buddhist connection. So I thought that it was interesting that you were comparing that to the Hebrew Bible. Is that what you went to just because that was what you were familiar with? That's what you had roots in?
Well, that's one reason. But I think the more important one was because of the great amount of similarity between the two sets of experiences, which was not the case when I compared the DMT effect to those of a presumed Zen Satori experience. I should qualify what I mean by Buddhist ideas about enlightenment or spiritual experience. I was, trained in the Zen tradition, which the goal other than living a better life. But that devolves from at the most elevated levels from an enlightenment experience, which is called Kensho or Satori. So the features of that state really didn't match those of the DMT volunteers' descriptions. But the prophetic state, if you read accounts in the text, are quite similar to those of the DMT effect.
And you said that one of the major differences in those experiences is that the prophetic message was better articulated in the religious context. Do you think that lent itself to that context because that language was already there? Because psychedelics, in and of themselves, they don't have their own thought system. They don't have their own philosophical system. They don't have their religion behind them.
Yeah, and so that's a key point. That is the key point in the Prophetic States book, DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, is that even though there's a huge degree of phenomenological overlap, the visions and the voices, the prophetic state contains information which has been around now for 2,000, 3,000 years, influences all aspects of civilization, law, theology, ethics, morals, architecture, poetry, economics, philosophy, law, political science. So you compare the information contained in the Hebrew Bible's conveyance through the prophetic experience and the information that's coming out of the psychedelic culture. The psychedelic culture, I think, has produced more in terms of aesthetics, than actual intellectual content. Psychedelic art, psychedelic music, psychedelic architecture, psychedelic dance, computer graphics, video games, all that is inspired by the psychedelic experience. But when it comes to actually philosophy or psychedelic religion, it really breaks down. It really depends on who takes the psychedelics. So most of the people who take psychedelics out there in the larger community are nature-based, religious or spiritual types. They like experience, aesthetics, as opposed to new ideas or the attainment of insights which are new, as opposed to just the confirmation beliefs that you already have, which I think usually is the case with the psychedelic experience. But is there new information that can be disseminated, communicated, and prove enduring, good, useful? I think that's much more the case with the prophetic stream. But still, DMT and other psychedelics have profound effects on consciousness. And you're a different person, or you're more of the same person, but in much fuller development. So how does that work? How does that happen? It makes you more of who you are. It makes you more of who you wish you were, or how you want to be, or who you think you are, but aren't quite sure. Have a big psychedelic trip, and if it turns out well, you're convinced now of certain truths that you weren't sure of before. But I think those truths are what you're already coming to the experience with. They may be more or less formed. They may be more or less conscious. They may be more or less desirable. And that's what the drugs are working on. In the case of the prophetic state, and I'm assuming that the DMT elevation in the brain, which occurs in someone in that context, they're in ancient Canaan or Egypt, or and they're experiencing visions and voices. The phenomenology could be mediated by endogenous DMT. It could be, but the stimulus for that elevated endogenous DMT is coming from above. It's coming from the spiritual realm, down into your mind-brain complex. Triggers a release of DMT, but the content of the visions, the information, the form that the visions take, aren't determined as much by you, but are determined as a result of the information contained in the overflow, the prophetic flash that comes that comes from above. So then you've got these visions that contain divine information, as it were. But you need to extract that information, and that's where the intellect comes in, the intelligence, the rational power, to deduce, to abstract, to synthesize ideas, which are then formulated into words, which are written or spoken, and are communicated to the larger community.
Well, what was it that drove you to choosing DMT amongst other psychedelics in the first place? Was it because it was something that also was endogenous, or, I mean, I know that DMT's in and out period is like 15 minutes. Did that affect your decision just out of mere convenience, as opposed to having to sit with somebody for 8 hours while they went up and down on an LSD trip?
Right. Well, we chose DMT for a couple of reasons. One of them is, as you note, it's in and out quickly. So I knew that the environment of a research unit would be stressful, and I didn't want people to have bad trips if it was 3, 4, 6, or 8 hours on a clinical research unit with experimental cancer chemotherapy. I figured I could get a handle on the environment for a half hour on that ward, and that would be good for a DMT experience. It was also obscure. People really didn't know about DMT very much at the time. This was the late 1980s, early 1990s, and Terence McKenna's rap was just beginning to diffuse through the larger society. It's endogenous, like you meant. Yeah, and because it was an obscure drug, the volunteers wouldn't have preconceptions about it, and it would go under the radar of the media. I figured if we started off with LSD or psilocybin just out of the blue in Albuquerque, it would get a lot more scrutiny than DMT. So that was another thing going for it. It is endogenous, and we don't know what it's doing or how it's made in a human. And there was a lot of interest back in the 70s about perhaps overproduction of DMT caused schizophrenia. And I said, we still don't know what the effects of DMT are, what the biology is, what the endocrinology is, what the brain image changes are. So that was another argument in favor of DMT. And the last one was it had been studied already in humans, so we didn't have to go back to the drawing board and do a lot of animal research. It was given in Hungary in the 50s, 60s. It was given in the U.S. in the 60s, early 70s. And it was given in a number of different centers in the U.S. Lexington, Kentucky, NIMH in Bethesda. I think Illinois, someplace in Illinois, one of the state hospitals. So it had a track record of human safety. So that was another reason that it was desirable. Oh, and one more thing is I had smoked it. I had smoked it once and was completely taken by it. I was winding down the melatonin work and just discovered DMT and was giving talks about DMT and the pineal gland and things like that. And I was at a meeting once with Terence McKenna, and he said, "Well, you're talking a lot about DMT. Would you like to try it?" So like an hour or two later, I had my first and only DMT trip, and it convinced me of the necessity, as it were, of studying DMT.
And Terence McKenna was the person that that hooked you up with it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was with a bunch of really great friends too. Everybody was in the room, and it was all quiet and candles and things. Yeah, just super cool people. And Terence was sitting for me, and he gave me instructions, and it was quite the evening.
Fantastic. So from the time that you had that experience to the time that you were doing your own experiments in the lab, what was the distance between those? How soon after?
Well, I submitted my grant applications and paperwork around 2 years after that. It took a lot of time to get things closed, down with the melatonin work and then gear up for the DMT work. So I had that experience in 1986 and submitted the paperwork in 1988.
And what was I going to say about DMT? Oh, you said that one of the reasons was that it was sort of an obscure substance. Do you think that your book and your studies helped to make it considerably less obscure?
Yeah, and especially the documentary, DMT, the Spirit Molecule documentary. That's been hugely popular. That was a fun film to put together. Mitch Schultz up in Austin, Texas, is the producer and contacted me, made me co-producer. So I'm invited, most of the talking heads and did most of the interviews, and we rounded up volunteers, old volunteers. So I did majority of the interviews. We got to go to New York twice and Berkeley once, Albuquerque. And so the documentary, when it was on Netflix, was the #1 streamed independent documentary on drugs for a while. Warner Brothers took it back. So it was really quite popular. And the book has done great too. It's sold almost 200,000 copies. Been translated into, I think, 13 languages and a popular audiobook. So if you think that at least 2 people read the book, that's close to 500,000 people have read the book, and I would say at least that many, maybe more, have watched the movie.
In your own personal experience, when you smoked DMT that one time, did you experience all of the things that you would later come to realize are kind of typical? Like, did you meet the beings? Were you welcomed into a space where it seemed like somebody was waiting for you?
It was completely crazy. Yeah, yeah, I could not have imagined it. Yeah, like it begins with a, crinkling, high pitched kind of sound, and then kind of blows up, sonically. The sound just collapses, but there still is a feeling of auditory fullness. Yeah, and you're out of your body. These incredible kaleidoscopic patterns, morphing, buzzing, moving rapidly, intensely colored. Yeah, and in my case, I beheld this uh, large, well, a waterfall of colors. And out of the waterfall emerged these like beings, 3 to 4 feet tall, maybe half a dozen of them. They looked like aliens more or less. Like bald and short, and yeah. And they said, "Now do you see? Now do you see? Now do you see?" And I had no idea what was going on. I just tried to pay attention and not freak out. Yeah, so it started to fade, and they faded away, and I started moving my body. And yeah, well, there's an interesting saying in other research world, that is, research is me search. So I think in this case, it certainly is true. Like I got started on this particular track because of trying to understand something that happened to me.
So the initial experience that you had, you weren't at all thinking at that point that you were maybe going to study this later on. It was completely organic the way that it stemmed from your experience.
Well, I was kind of in betwixt and between careers or scientific projects. I had completed the melatonin study, or had halfway completed it. Well, let's see. Yeah, I was about done with the melatonin study. It was a 2-year project. Well, actually, that's not true. I finished the melatonin project in 1987. So I was still in the midst of the pineal project when I gave this talk. And I was thinking about DMT. Like I was talking about the pineal gland because I'd been studying it. I presented some of the preliminary data, and it wasn't that impressive, a psychedelic substance. So in the meantime, on my own, I've been kind of rooting around the DMT literature. I didn't know that much about it yet, but I was kind of speculating, like, oh, it might be made in the pineal. It might be involved in spiritual experience. But I was kind of talking without much scientific knowledge at the time. I had just started to look into it, and without any firsthand knowledge. So I did, in the talk I gave that drew Terrence's attention, I was talking about the pineal, about DMT, about enlightenment, and things like that.
So back to the most recent book that I read. So through your wait, no, I forgot. I completely forgot. There's one more question I wanted to ask before I leapt into this. I have heard a few different stories about why you discontinued your DMT research, but obviously you're going to have the more truthful of the stories. What caused you to stop doing the experiments? Did you run out of funding, or did it freak you out, or?
Well, so how about you answering that question first from me? I mean, what have you heard? And then I'll do my best to set the record straight.
Well, the most recent version I've heard was the more leaning towards the outcomes that you were getting from people's experiences were just a little too out of the ordinary than you expected them to be, and you I think that I heard that something to the effect of, uh, what are these experiments in the long run going to prove anyway? Um, and that you just kind of got cold feet and stopped.
Well, it's complicated. I mean, obviously, as your you know comments indicate. Well, I mean, I could describe what was going on then, which led to the ending of the research, and I could describe how I see it now. 25 years later. I mean, I finished that study in 1995. So talk about project having legs. I mean, it's just gotten more and more interesting in the DMT world and the psychedelic world. But yeah, it's been 25 years. So I've had a lot of time to reflect on what happened, what went right, what went wrong, what would I have done differently if I had to do it again, or if I had the opportunity, or if I had to. Yeah, well, what was going on at the time was that I just didn't know how to understand people's experiences. They weren't freaking me out that much. I mean, after a while, they start to blend together. There's some common themes which are repeated from person to person. So even though they're strange, I got used to them. But I just didn't know what kind of context to put it in. It certainly wasn't the Buddhist Kensho Satori experience I was expecting, which I was kind of prepared to discuss with the volunteers and put into some context. But these beings who were doing things to the volunteers and psychic telepathic communication and interactions, and flying to different planets and star systems, and I didn't really have a model, and I couldn't really help people understand what it was they had just undergone. I mean, I was the scaffolding that I brought to this study was the Buddhist Kensho model, the psychoanalytic model. This is symbolic. The interactions, the visions, the conversations are symbolic. They represent previously unconscious wishes or drives. But basically treating the experience as something else. It isn't a real thing. It's symbolic of something else. It's a metaphor. The other model was this is your brain on drugs model. Like, this is just a brain reflex brought about by giving a drug stimulating serotonin 2A receptors. And the volunteers said, well, that's not what it feels like. And even if it was the result of those receptors being dinged, why would was it taking that particular form and possessing that particular set of attributes? So it really didn't explain why, or what was the underlying principle behind giving DMT, controlling the the mechanism. Why was the brain set up that way? You give DMT and people have these visions of beings interacting with them out of body, travel through distant space. So the psychopharmacological model was strong. The psychoanalytic model was strong. The Buddhist maybe not quite so much. But all three of them posited the unreality, the the non-substantiality of what was actually going on. That they weren't really objective experiences; they were more translated from something of lower order into what was manifest. But one of the most striking and convinced qualities of the DMT experience is the feeling that what they're witnessing is more real than real. So I had to take that into account, because if I just said that feeling of more real than real is just a brain center mediating reality, that gets kind of crazy, because, well, does that mean that this level of reality is sustained by some brain activity, and you stimulate that part of the brain and things seem even more real? Well, what happens if you remove that part of the brain or dampen its function? So I just took a leap, as it were, a leap of scientific faith. Like, if it is more real than real, then let's look at systems that posit that altered states of consciousness like that are more real than real, that they are the fundamental bedrock of reality. So that's where I was saying why I stopped. Well, yeah, basically it was because I didn't know enough to explain and to help walk the volunteers through their experiences. It was just I don't think I got cold feet as much as I was in over my head, and I didn't like giving that amount of DMT to that many people without really solid footing underneath me to contain and help people integrate those experiences. There were other factors at the time when I stopped. Staffing was difficult. My nurse, my student, it was hard to get stable, stable time-wise, position-wise, and psychologically stable staff. It was pretty out there work, and you really needed to have your feet on the ground. I really didn't have any mentors. There's nobody in the world doing this kind of work. Certainly, nobody at UNM, nobody in the U.S. I didn't have that much in the way of peer support. It was basically me and a couple of friends, but they weren't really involved in the actual implementation of the study. It was me, my wife, my Buddhist community, a handful of friends. Yeah, and that was just impossible. I mean, one man couldn't bear that burden. So yeah, I just kind of after 5 years, 400 doses of DMT all by myself, pretty much. I just said, okay, I've had it. I need to take a break.
That's a lot of stuff for one person to carry around. I mean, what a mind-blowing experience and substance that is. It's amazing that you wrangled the permission to be able to study it in the first place. I'm so glad that happened, that you were able to do that. So to go to, do you have something to say? Oh, I thought you were trying to get my attention.
Yeah. Well, I was kind of making a point to myself as much as to you. Yeah, it was a completely unexpected study. I surprised everybody. Just kind of came out of the blue. Like I said, like I was a established young investigator. I had published in the best endocrinology journals, physiology journals. Yeah, so I had my bona fides as as accomplished researcher at the beginning of his career. So I had so I had the chops. The first article I had ever written about psychedelics, was an exhaustive review of the adverse effects of LSD. I read 300 articles, and wrote a review, and I wrote a state-of-the-art review paper on adverse effects of psychedelics, because I knew the first thing that the FDA and the DEA and everybody would ask is, aren't these drugs too dangerous to give, even in the medical setting? And I said, well, not really. Read this paper. So I was prepared, for that eventuality. Yeah, and it surprised. Well, it was virgin territory. there hadn't been any new psychedelic studies in the U.S. in a long time, 20 years or so. Nobody had studied DMT for a long time, and especially not IV. So the drawbacks of being a lone ranger we talked about, but the advantages were great as well. I mean, I could just do pretty much what I wanted to, within reason, but there weren't any precedents. So everything that we did was brand new. And there have been a handful of DMT studies since ours, and they don't want to give larger than 0.3 milligrams per kilogram. Well, so in our study, the large, dose of DMT was slightly higher, 0.4 milligrams per kilogram. But other groups have looked at our data, the results, the descriptions of the experiences, and they, decided to go one step lower, 0.3 rather than 0.4. And 0.3 is fully psychedelic. The threshold at which it becomes clearly psychedelic is 0.2. For our volunteers, a lot of people preferred 0.3 over our slightly higher dose of 0.4. For some people, 0.4 was about too much, but it never was. But still, it was kind of hair-raising, and you have a bit more control both as the researcher and as the volunteer at that slightly lower dose. So what I'm saying is that nobody, or it's unlikely anytime soon that anybody would give the kinds of doses of DMT that we gave back then as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, the big question, it seems like, with psychedelics, especially when you're talking about psychedelics and spiritual experience, is that, okay, is the psychedelic causing us to hallucinate a religious or a spiritual experience, or is it allowing our brain to access that spiritual experience? The kind of the thing that keeps coming up in the book, the if so, so what deal. What were your conclusions?
Yeah. Like, is the experience in your mind a result of your mind generating it or receiving it? Generating it or perceiving it? That's the $64,000 question. But before we get to that, we were talking about doses of DMT. Even though it's unlikely or there isn't any interest on the horizon of giving single doses of DMT at the levels that we did, there is a study underway or underfoot, I'm not sure what the expression is, it's in the planning stages at Imperial College in London, to develop a continuous infusion of DMT. Just keep someone in that state for as long as need be. Obviously as long as it can be tolerated and is safe. But this was a suggestion which I made at the end of the DMT book, DMT, the Spirit Molecule, and it was picked up by a young British researcher in Japan, Andrew Gallimore, and we wrote a paper a few years ago, kind of sketching out, the mechanics of the infusion and, why it's important. And, so the group at Imperial College, their Psychedelic Research Institute, is interested in implementing that infusion protocol. So, we're working on, or, they're working on consulting. They're working on the initial dose and, titration, go up, go down. The advantage of a continuous infusion like that is you can really monitor and control the experience. Let's say you're doing psychotherapy with somebody, they're depressed. You can start off at a low dose, get them used to the state, then crank it up higher and higher and higher, And then if they give the signal, like lower it down, you can lower it, and within a few minutes somebody can start speaking. So they can describe what occurred in their visions, and their therapist could work with them, and they would agree on re-entering that state and working it through, and then coming back down, so on and so forth. So I think it'd be a great tool for psychotherapy, and yeah, compared to like you swallow some psilocybin or LSD and you're committed. It's just like it's up and down. You'll go in and out of it, but you won't be sober, and you won't be able to get higher at any point after the pharmacology begins to decline. You can also, I think, use that state or the continuous infusion model to study the DMT state. Like, who are these beings and what do they have to say? And, what's the optimal way of interacting with them? What is, the nature of the contents? Like if, there's a swirling, merry-go-round in front of you, I mean, can you walk up and get onto one of the horses, or do you sink through? So I think it'll be interesting to really explore that state carefully. First of all, there's no conclusive answer. We just don't know. I think it's worth entertaining both poles of the spectrum and see if there could be some synthesis in the middle. I think what the psychedelic drugs do is they stimulate the imagination, and I'm using the term imagination in the Aristotelian sense. Aristotle divided the mind into two functions, two arenas. One is the imagination, the imaginative faculty, and it's the repository in the mind of perception, feelings, emotions, physical sensations, everything but words, everything but ideas and concepts. The rational faculty or their intellectual faculty, or the intellect, is the repository of ideas. And it remembers ideas, it can synthesize ideas, it can come up with new ideas. The imagination is the realm of everything else except ideas. So it's sight, sound, touch, taste, feel. It's sad, happy. It's the shape of things, tactile, emotional, and the abstract part of things is taken care of by the intellectual part of the mind. So I think what the psychedelics do, I'm still developing these ideas. I think they stimulate the imagination, and it hypertrophies, it puts on steroids the function of the imagination. Colors are brighter, and you start seeing colors where there aren't really any. Let's say with your eyes closed, your emotions are clearer and more intense. So those are all things that I think are more modified through the psychedelics than the psychedelic stimulating the intellect along the lines that we were talking about. It isn't like there's new philosophies of the psychedelic experience coming out of the psychedelic culture. There isn't a new religion. It's more of the character of the person who experienced the psychedelic state. So basically, I think DMT stimulates the imagination, it's responsible for the um, it's responsible, for the building blocks of the visions. You can't have, visions without activation of the visual sense. So there needs to be, color. There needs to be contours and form, shape. So DMT stimulates the putting together of those visual building blocks. What the content then is of the building blocks assembled in a certain manner, what the meaning of those visions would be is determined then by the mind, let's say the intellect, the rational faculty, thinking, what does that mean? What do three horsemen on three horses mean? What does it mean that they're standing in the water? To extract the information contained in the visions. So you need to have a well-developed intellect to get the most out of your visions. It seems to me you need to study. You need to think truth as much as you can determine it. You want to be a good person. You don't want to have people giving you a hard time because you're not virtuous. You want to be virtuous and supported, and not dragged down by the effects of your behavior. So you need to develop other parts of your self than just purely the imagination. You need to develop the intellect, the rational part of yourself, which is your personality in a lot of ways, your work, your relationships. So in the normal everyday DMT experience, you're in a lab, you get an injection of DMT, or you smoke it, or you drink ayahuasca. The imagination is stimulated from below. You take something in, and it affects the DMT levels in your brain. And that's called neurotheology. That kind of model. It's a bottom up model. It's this is your brain on drugs. There's like a part of the brain gets stimulated by drugs, by psychedelics, and voila, you experience the DMT effect. So the other model is a top-down model. It's it's what I call theoneurology, theoneurology from the top down. So that is, this is your brain on God. This is what happens when the prophetic impulse descends upon you, from outside of you. It then stimulates elevated levels of DMT in your mind, in your brain. And your intellect then needs to extract information. The content from the bottom up is just you. If you're giving DMT, it's the source is different, as it were, even though it's just the same brain DMT. So in our volunteers anyway, people experience, the content that they experienced was much less fulsome than their descriptions of the DMT state, the colors, the beings, whatnot. The information that they contained, if so, so what, was largely personal. They worked through, let's say, emotional blockages. They understood cultural differences in a new way. Somebody wanted a near-death experience, and she had one, and it was profound, and it was moving, and it was real, and it confirmed a lot of her beliefs. But there wasn't much transcendent. there were no insights about God's nature, let's say. So I think it's more just the amplification and uncovering of things which are already in the personality and the mind of the person. So, the information is more personal. From the top down, model, if the prophetic, prophetic overflow, as it were, is responsible for the DMT induced visions, then that content is coming in from the outside. And if you're trained enough to recognize or extract that information from those divinely inspired, rather than purely personal visions which take place on the screen of the imagination. If you've been a pious person, if you have been studying and praying, acting good, believe in God, want to hear God's word, your friends support you, your family does, then you're prepared for the visions, and then you can get information which is interpreted through a lens which is culturally appropriate, uses a language that everybody knows. So DMT or other psychedelics increase the activity of the imaginative faculty, and one is from below. You give the drug. One is from above. You're being inspired. You're undergoing prophecy, and then it's up to you, your intellect, to understand and pull out what the content is. If you're psychologically minded, you're given DMT, you have some visions, you can interpret it and understand it in a very useful way. That's one of the reasons I think a continuous infusion of DMT would be terrific addition to the psychotherapeutic armamentarium. Okay, yeah, I was just getting off track there. So if you've been working on yourself in a particular way, you're able to get that information, and with the hypertrophy, the overstimulation of the imagination, the visions are clear. I mean, they're unmistakable. There's not much confusion, as opposed to just thinking about issues. So that's the the beauty and the strength of the psychedelic effect. But that doesn't clear you of responsibility of getting the most out of it, which involves training your mind and educating yourself.
Absolutely. Now that this book that we're talking about has been out for 6 years, what have been some of the reactions that you've been getting from the scientific and religious communities?
I haven't heard much from the scientific community, and that's an interesting story in and of itself. The scientific community is really fixated, at least right now, on the mystical experience, the kensho, the white light, the dissolving of the ego, no thoughts, no feelings, no time, no space. The scientific, psychedelic community is fixated on that state, and at least if you follow the thinking of some researchers, the interactive state, the prophetic state, is inferior to the unitive mystical state. The interactive relational state is inferior because it's limited by content. But I mean, according to who exactly is that the case? That's just this is what I think.
Exactly.
You can really make statements like that. One of the problems in the prophetic experience, though, if you're really going to look carefully at it, is its content, and its content is Jewish. It has to do with Israel. It has to do with the land of Israel. It has to do with the Jews. It has to do with the Gentiles. And it gets very, very sticky very quickly. The thing about the mystical experience is you could just say what you want about it as far as what the content is. And that's what people do. They just kind of make it up as they go along, or they take some Buddhism, they take some shamanism, some New Age stuff, and it's like if it's all one, it doesn't really matter. But if it isn't all one, if it's dual, you have to deal with that. So once that starts coming up for discussion, people don't want to hear it, which is one of the reasons I think the scientific community has been lukewarm to the prophetic model. The religious community, it's been cool. I mean, it's been good. I'd say most of the people I've heard from are Christians with an interest in prophecy. And then, Muslims. There's a long tradition of prophecy contained in Islam. The transmission of the Quran to the Prophet occurred through an angel. So they're interested in the prophetic experience. The group that has least contacted me is the Jews, and I'm not sure why that is actually. I sent a book to a renowned academic rabbi who is interested in the interface of religion and of science, and he just wasn't. He didn't respond. I think one of the discomforts that may arise in the Jewish community, although I just don't know firsthand, is that I make some recommendations for revivifying prophecy using DMT. For example, study the Bible on DMT, like a low dose, let's say, or study the Bible on a psychedelic drug. Mm-hmm. To the extent that the prophetic state and the psychedelic state share some features, what better way to get nourished in the psychedelic state than by reading a venerable text which is transmitted in a psychedelic like experience. And I think that smacks a bit of something like it isn't that kosher, or at least it's not kosher right now. Uh-huh. And there's also a long-standing rabbinic tradition that prophecy ended around the middle of the time of the Second Temple, maybe 100 BCE or so. To claim that a drug could bring back prophecy, at least from a traditional rabbinic point of view, it's quite controversial, and nobody really wants to go near that.
Well, I mean, going back to Terence McKenna, I think he brushed on the idea in Food of the Gods, but in general, in his talks and in his writings, he professed that he was, he thought it very likely that a lot of religions came out of drug experiences, came out of a society's interaction with a substance, and that the two sort of went hand in hand.
Well, that could be. And there's been suggestions about what plants or whatever the prophets or people experiencing prophecy might have ingested. Latin American shamanism is quite connected to plant medicines, psychedelics. But at least when it comes to the Bible, there really isn't any evidence for ingestion, at least large scale, even individually, for the ingestion of a psychedelic substance. You can predict, or you can speculate it as a mushroom or a fungus or acacia, but the existence of endogenous DMT makes looking for an outside source of DMT or another psychedelic moot, because if your brain can produce DMT on its own, even if it's not from God, but from starvation or fasting or sensory deprivation, chanting, drumming, whatnot, if your brain can then produce DMT on its own, elevated DMT, then there really is no need to endlessly look around, to scrape every bark and look under every rock and whatever for the biblical psychedelics.
What do you think that someone who has some religious experience or knowledge might have an advantage in the DMT realm over someone who doesn't or hasn't?
Oh yeah. I'm glad you brought that up. One of the recommendations I make in the Prophetic States book, DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, is that if you're familiar with the Hebrew Bible, for example, you would be able to interact with the DMT state more efficiently, more fulsomely. One of the striking features of the DMT experience is encounter with beings, and one of the striking, these striking features of biblical, prophetic experience is encounters with angels or with God. So there's a lot of descriptions of what kind of questions the person undergoing also and how, and also negotiating tactics, like can you get more information, or explanatory requests like what does this mean? I have no idea what it is that I'm seeing. What does that mean? So those are all vignettes and little excerpts that you can extract from the Hebrew Bible. How to recognize a good angel versus a bad angel. Is it this aspect of God that you're witnessing, or that aspect? So you're armed with more information, and you're armed with some techniques that worked in the prophetic state that looks like a DMT state. So if you're in the DMT state and you've got these tools, I think you're that much further ahead.
Do you think that prophecy still exists, or did it die along with bicamerality? And while we're at it, what is bicamerality?
Bicamerality. Well, it might be the end of bicamerality, but there's no hard evidence to demonstrate that the brain changed then. So it's just like soft tissue that dissolves, and that's the evidence that you're looking for, is that the communication between the the communication between the hemispheres was cut at a certain point in prehistory, or even history. Yeah, like in early history, in the ancient world. Yeah, but there isn't any evidence one way or the other that took place, and the the reasons that may have occurred are valid, like a volcanic explosion, but still that doesn't translate into the brain's different. Well, did prophecy end at a certain point? I think it just went underground. I mean, that's my answer. Like, I'm glad I'm not a rabbi. I don't have a school to defend, or a school of belief that I have got to adhere to. So I can make it up as I go along as well. But still, it's grounded in study. You should see my libraries. I've been studying this material for over 20 years and have had some good mentors. I think I think the rabbis were expedient. This was not a good time for prophecy. The Romans were occupying Judea. Prophets, one of their hallmarks is to speak truth to power, and they're eccentric, and they knock on the door, the gates of the king, and say, "You're a scumbag, and God's going to burn down your palace if you don't behave." That's not what you want your kinsmen, the Jews, at the time of Roman occupation, to be doing. That's going to really bring down the boot heel of the Romans. So the rabbis, by saying, there's no more prophecy. These people are crazy. They're not prophets because we closed the book on prophecy. There are no more prophets. So I think, that was the expedient perspective that the rabbis needed, to take at the time. But if you read the Talmud, the material that took place after the closing of the Bible, and, the Zohar, the Kabbalah fundamental text, there's a lot of prophecy, lots of flights to the various, heavens, interactions with angels, witnessing God's glory. The Hasidic sects are quite ecstatic spiritual visions. The founder of Hasidism had these flights to heaven. He would smoke this pipe and have flights to heaven. So it just went underground. It kind of located itself on the periphery of Judaism, mainstream Judaism. Modern Orthodox, I think, would be the most critical, in a good way, of any idea of bringing back the prophetic experience. And they would be the ones that would probably trace their lineage back to the rabbis who declared the end of prophecy at that time.
Do you think that there is prophecy outside of the context of religion?
Well, there are spiritual experiences. Prophecy is a type of spiritual experience that occurs within the Jewish biblical setting. It's a category of spiritual experience. So other things would not be prophecy if they didn't occur within that context. Strictly speaking, you could still have spiritual emanation impacting your mind, your imagination, and your intellect. From the outside, wouldn't be necessarily just on your own personal stuff. But it wouldn't be technically speaking prophecy.
Well, we mentioned spiritual experiences that happen within the context of a religion and that just happen within the context of anything else, basically, and that there isn't per se a religion or philosophy that psychonauts adhere to. For instance, do you think that partially, especially in the case of DMT, partially the reason for that is because it's really difficult to bring back anything coherent from something that's so otherworldly?
Well, that is possible, but at the same time, people's descriptions of the state are quite detailed, quite deep, quite broad. I saw this. This is what it did. This is how I felt. This is the sound it made. This is what it said to me. This is what it did to me. This is what I did to it. So it isn't just a confused state. I mean, there's really precise observation taking place. So I think if there were more information available, they would have brought that back too. It may have been that they didn't have the vocabulary and the tools, but it also may have been that there just wasn't much of a novel information content that accompanied the phenomenology, the visions.
And when your volunteers were going through these experiences, you and the attendant nurse would meditate in the room with them, right?
A light meditation, zazen, just sit. So we just sat, quietly. We were extremely attentive. It was very strange in that room, so we really paid attention. But we weren't, focusing on the volunteer as much as focusing on focusing. Like just being aware, what's happening, like in the room, on the ward, in the patient, with the machines, outside. Yeah, we just tried to stay aware and responded as quickly as possible, as quickly as we could, to any kinds of exigencies that the volunteer might be undergoing. Were they cold? Were they hot? Did they want to throw up? Was this uncomfortable? did they want to hold a hand? Yeah, we didn't have any bells and whistles. Let's say no candles, no crystals, no music. It was a very inner-directed experience. We had to put black eye shades on the volunteers after the first few doses because of the group of volunteers. It became clear rather quickly that it was just way too distracting to have the visions overlaid on a hospital room. So we employed black eye shades. But we just and it's important also to point out that we were not doing therapy. We were not helping people meditate. We didn't want people to have any kind of experience other than their own. So if you look at most of the studies nowadays, they have a well, that's not entirely true, but to a large extent, studies have got a goal: become better as a person in your own psychotherapy, improve your meditation at a meditation retreat. So there was a demand, which in a way was more than the person of the volunteer themselves. So in our group, in our study, we just said hands off. We're going to be hands off. We'll be available, but it's your trip. We want you to go in there and tell us what happens. And that was pretty much it. So, and our questionnaire also that we gave people afterwards to fill out with a pencil didn't really have a theoretical orientation. We weren't measuring mystical experience. We weren't measuring ego dissolution. We weren't measuring psychosis. All of which you give DMT, those scores increase. We were asking people, what did it look like? How were the colors? What did you feel like? What was going on with your body? What were you thinking? Did it feel real? Just like very simple building block kinds of questions. So I think our study, besides that it took place so early, one of its strengths is that it just is a more straightforward description of the DMT effect than one in which a drug of any sort is given for a larger secondary purpose, second order purpose.
Gotcha. Well, I want to be mindful of your time, so I just have a couple of really quick questions, and then I will let you go about your evening. How do you feel about the use of psychedelics in general in a therapeutic setting?
I think they can be very useful, but they have to be given, taken in the right hands, in the right the right setting. Skilled therapist, informed patient. I think not being dogmatic about a therapeutic technique, I think, is important at this stage in the game. I don't think I don't think a mystical experience is the curative aspect of the psychedelic state in psychotherapy. It's one possible healing mechanism. But it isn't the only one. The interactive relational experiences might be just as therapeutic. I think it's one of the great things about psychedelics is they can enhance the therapeutic process.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any a book or any studies or anything that you're working on right now that you might fill us in on?
Well, in March last year, I published a novel called Joseph Levy Escapes Death. And it's a thinly veiled autobiographical novel about a character, Joseph Levy, who underwent a year of poor health and recovery in a small southwest town. And it's a tale of bumbled internet relationships, medical horror comedy, philosophical musings. That book came out in March last year. And I'm currently working on having it turned into an Audible book, which is a very interesting process. So, that book came out in March. I injured my arm a couple of months after that, and I haven't been doing much writing. I've picked it up the last month. So I'm working, what I'm, working on, that's, what I'm writing. And it's, it's another installment of the, Joseph Levy saga. It's his, childhood, his, drug taking in college, and his kind of breaking, down into a bipolar state. So that's kind of what's occupying me with writing. I'm always, well, I wouldn't say always. I'm frequently consulting other groups around the world, academic, pharmaceutical. I review manuscripts for publication in scientific journals about psychedelics. I do about one of those every 3 months or so, every 4 months, which I really love doing because you can influence the next generation of researchers through careful critique of these manuscripts. And you can advance the field too in a way that you think is most appropriate. I'd like to try my hand at some biblical fiction. I really love the character of Abraham. I've really studied him carefully. So at some point, I'd like to do that. Some biblical fiction. I probably have got about a half a dozen installments of the saga of Joseph Levy that I've got potential. So
Cool.
I'll just do this one for as long as need be, and see what's next. But I think I'm going to do another novel about the same character.
Fantastic. That sounds fantastic. I will have to look into that. I didn't realize that you were working on fiction too, so I definitely want to check that out. And I also, Rick, I would like to thank you very much for taking the time to sit down and talk about this stuff. And there's, of course, plenty more that we could talk about, but perhaps we could continue it sometime at a later date. Can you tell the listeners where they can find your work or keep up on what you're doing? And
for sure, yeah. My website is rickstrassman.com, and I answer every email. I'm on Facebook. I don't answer every email that comes by on Facebook. If you want to write me, you can, contact me through my website. So those are the ways that people get in touch. Facebook, I'll announce stuff, books or talks or podcasts which are live, and random ideas. I need to get a blog. I need to get a video channel. All that. But Facebook is where that stuff gets posted. My website is a place to order books, which I will inscribe and sign, and to make contact. And my blog, which is kind of meager.
Well, thank you again. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your studies and your experiences. And I very much appreciate it. And perhaps we can speak again sometime later on down the line.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, my pleasure. I had a good time.
Well, that was a really delightful conversation. Rick is such a down-to-earth person and very humble and good-humored. So it was a pleasure to talk to him. I hope that you all enjoyed the conversation and look into at least the two books that we talked about, DMT, The Spirit Molecule, which also is a documentary, an excellent documentary, kind of hard to find on the internet, but not impossible. Hint, Vimeo. And DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, which is his later book, although it was still written 6 years ago. The research still is applicable and important. So I highly suggest and recommend both of those books to begin with. And DMT is such a vast universe to try to map. Very courageous of Rick to even set out to do such a thing. And I think that's, from what he said, that's kind of one of the reasons that he he stopped is just it was so vast, and he couldn't think of a good reason to sort of edge these people to volunteer and subject themselves to a DMT trip, which is pretty intense. I have never tried it myself. I am very interested in trying it, but just reading about people's experiences in DMT, the spirit molecule, was just mind-blowing. The things that were found. And Terence McKenna, who I started the episode off with, was always relating a story of the time that he took a Tibetan Lama, so a supposedly well-known Tibetan Lama, took him aside and convinced him to try DMT just to get his take on it. And the Tibetan Lama said, "This is basically a near-death experience. This is a ticket to the Bardo, basically," which is very fascinating because, as you heard in the interview, a lot of people came away from that experience not fearing death at all. So I think that's on so many levels such important testimony to hear for afterlife people and for altered states people. So there's a lot to sift through there, and I highly recommend both of those books. And if you enjoyed this episode and MELT episodes in general, a way that you can support, a very direct way, would be financially. You can go to www.patreon.com/themeltpodcast, and for as little as $1 a month, you can help to chip in to sort of keep the wheels moving here and hopefully expanding here. I would like to do so much more with this podcast, and being able to have the money to do it is imperative. First and foremost, I would love to have the time to be able to do more podcasts, more episodes. So that financial help in that area would help immensely as far as that is concerned. Another way of helping would be sharing. There's ways to share on the MELT podcast website, and obviously all you tech-savvy people know how to share things in your favorite social media info harvesting arena of choice. And I do appreciate that. And it's a very underrated way of contributing, is sharing it on Facebook or Instagram or wherever it is that you go and spend probably way too much time. I'm assuming that you guys maintain a good balance between real life and virtual life. Right? Right, of course. So any of those ways of helping would be greatly appreciated. And I'm always accepting stories too, and suggestions for guests. But stories about things, the kinds of things that we have talked about on the MELT, and things that you foresee or you could see in the context of the MELT podcast. You can send them to themeltpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you all so very, very much. It is much appreciated if you've made it this far, and I really hope that you're enjoying this podcast, and I have many more wonderful guests and things coming up. So I hope that you guys will stay tight. I hope you'll spread the word, leaving good reviews and star ratings on any of the places that you get your podcasts, like iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, the like, would be much appreciated too. Thank you all so much. I appreciate you, and stay tuned for more. Take care.